Well, hello and welcome. I'm Mariette Bates, and I am the director of the Disability Studies program here at the CUNY School of Professional Studies. And if you don't know about us, we offer about 60 courses in disability studies every year. A lot of our courses are online. We offer a bachelor's degree, an advanced certificate in disability studies, a Master's of Arts in Disability Studies, and a Master's of Science in Disability, in a Master's in Disability Services and Higher Ed. I'm sorry, I'm in disability studies land today, so forgive me. I want to extend a very warm welcome to those of you who are here in person and to all of you who are here attending remotely. We can't see you, but we're happy that you're here. For those of you who are attending remotely. This is the first in a series of disability studies events this fall at CUNY, both here at the School of Professional Studies and at the Graduate Center. My colleagues, Dr. Julia Miele Rodas and Joe Strauss, who are here, are offering a doctoral level course in disability culture and society with support from the Futures Initiative at the Graduate Center. That course meets on Wednesdays, and as an extension of that endeavor, these series of public lectures are being offered on Wednesdays throughout this semester. They're coordinated by Dr. Rodas and Dr. Strauss and supported by Heather Zeman here at the School of Professional Studies, who was at the front desk when you came in. So this is a good time to turn off cell phones if you have them, so that when Julia is giving her talk, she doesn't get interrupted by beeps and buzzes and so forth. Okay, so this speaker series is co-sponsored by our Disability Studies program, the Disability Studies Scholars here at CUNY, the Futures Initiative, the CUNY Graduate Center Program in Music, Columbia University's Seminar on Disability, and the John F. Kennedy Jr. Institute for Worker Ed, which is located here at CUNY SPS. Dr. Rodas and I are founding members and co-chairs of the Disability Studies Scholars here at CUNY, which is an informal group of CUNY faculty, students, and staff with a shared interest in disability studies. As we've worked together over the last couple of years, I've come to know Julia well during that time. So it's a particular pleasure that I introduce her to you tonight. Dr. Rodas is a professor of English at Bronx Community College, part of the City University of New York, for those of you who don't know. She earned her master's in philosophy and her PhD in English from the CUNY Graduate Center and holds a BA in liberal arts from Sarah Lawrence College. Julia is a disability studies scholar and Victorianist, co-editor of a collection on disability called Jane Eyre, The Mad Woman and the Blind Man, published by Ohio State University Press, co-editor of the Literary Disability Studies book series for Palgrave Macmillan, and her writing has appeared in numerous books and journals, including Victorian Literature and Culture, Dickens Studies Annual, the Victorian Review, Journal of Literary and Cultural Disability Studies, Disability Studies Quarterly, and other venues. Dr. Rodas teaches writing, literature, and disability studies at Bronx Community College, as well as guest courses at Lehman College, the CUNY School for Professional Studies, and the CUNY Graduate Center. She's also co-chair of the Columbia University Seminar on Disability, Culture, and Society. Her talk tonight is in celebration of her newly published book, Autistic Disturbances, copies of which you saw outside at the table, and I hope you'll all purchase one. It theorizes the role of autistic rhetoric and aesthetic in literature, and it exemplifies interdisciplinary disability scholarship. I look forward very much to hearing Dr. Rodas's talk tonight, so please join me in welcoming her.
First of all, I want to thank all of you for coming out. I really appreciate it. There are a lot of lonely hours in the library doing work like this, and you know, sometimes I was sustained by this moment in my imagination, so I really, really do appreciate all of you being present. I also want to say a special thank you to Fritz V, from whom I got the name of this talk. He was an autistic kid who was interviewed by Leo Kanner back in the day, the 40s. And this phrase, because the butterfly, is in response to Kanner's question about the difference between a fly and a butterfly. And Fritz V said, because the butterfly is snowed with snow. And I don't think that Kanner made great use of the language that he collected there. I also want to thank Mariette, who co-chairs the CUNY Disability Scholars, and to Jessica Murray. I don't know if she's here, but she's also co-chair of the CUNY Disability Scholars, who is also co-sponsoring this event. But Mariette's making the space available and the resources to co-sponsor this talk has been very, very important. Thank you to Joe Strauss, who also helped to arrange the talk, to the CUNY Disability Scholars at Large, to Heather Zeman for your arranging, to Loti Silber, my co-chair of the Columbia University Seminar in Disability Culture and Society, to Liz Bowen, who is also an instrumental part of that group. And Liz, do you have something you need to add right now? My thanks also to the Futures Initiative, to the Graduate Center Program in Music, and to the many, many people who supported me and my work as I went along. But especially to the two people to whom the book is dedicated, my beloved husband, Estuardo Rodas, and my beloved advisor, Jack Hall. Thank you. I just want to make a quick note about PowerPoint. I am using PowerPoint tonight, but I know that not everyone can see, not everybody, it's not a helpful resource for everyone. So I'm reassuring you that if you need a script, there is a script available for you. I think even a script in large print. And if you have some other accessibility need, if you need to get up, need to move around the room, that's of course perfectly fine. The PowerPoint slides follow the script, so everything should be captured verbally also, but we'll also do some verbal description along the way. And I'm going to start here with this picture of the contents from my son's pockets. One day in the winter a couple of years ago, I emptied out his coat pockets, and this is what I saw. And actually, I'd like this to be a little interactive. People shout out just anything that you see. There's crumpled paper. What else? Plastic. There's a bouncy ball, rubber band, a yo-yo. There's a mint. God, I missed that. Sunglasses, yeah. Say again? No, it's not an Easter egg. It's an egg shaker, one of those things that you shake and your arm goes ch-ch-ch-ch-ch. There's some folded takeout menus, busted up plastic cup, chapstick, a rock, and some assorted dirt and leaves, some change. I don't think I could even say everything that was in his pockets. But I'm showing this at the outset because it makes me think of this passage from Mark Twain's Tom Sawyer. So this is the scene right after Tom has conned everyone into painting this fence for him. And in fact, he's been paid. And this is what he gets paid with. Tom was literally rolling in wealth. He had a dead rat and a string to swing it with, 12 marbles, part of a Jew's harp, a piece of blue bottle glass to look through, a spool cannon, a key that wouldn't unlock anything, a fragment of chalk, a glass stopper of a decanter, a tin soldier, a couple of tadpoles, 6 firecrackers, a kitten with only one eye, a brass doorknob, a dog collar, but no dog, the handle of a knife, 4 pieces of orange peel, and a dilapidated old window sash. Now, the reason I'm starting here is because I want to open with this question about what constitutes waste. the stuff in my son's pockets is in my son's pockets because that's treasure for him, the same way the stuff that Tom collects is treasure for him. And it's an important question at the outset because in the very moment that autism is first invented or first identified, it lines up also with this same moment that Leo Kanner, who first wrote about autism in 1943 in an article called Autistic Disturbances of Affective Contact. He is starting out talking about autistic language as waste, something that's kind of like garbage language. So specifically, one of the things that Kanner says is that autistic language is semantically and conversationally valueless. And when he talks about autistic language being valueless, this is the sort of thing that he's talking about. And here I'm actually going to call upon Liz Bowen, who is herself a poet, to read out some of the words of Elaine C., who Kanner wrote about in his article.
Dinosaurs don't cry. Crayfish, sharks, fish, and rocks. Butterflies live in children's stomachs and in their panties too. Fish have sharp teeth and bite little children. There's war in the sky. Gargoyles bite children and drink oil. Gargoyles have milk bags. I will crush old angleworm, he bites children. Needlehead, pink wee-wee, has a yellow leg, cutting the dead deer. Poison deer, poor Elaine. No tadpoles in the house. Men broke deer's leg. Seals and salamanders. Bears and foxes.
Here's another example of autistic language. This is from an early article by Hans Asperger. He quoted one child anonymously who said, "I can't do this orally, only headily." This is a personal favorite of mine, again from Leo Kanner, a child named Donald T., who, when he was asked to subtract 4 from 10, answered, "I'll draw a hexagon." Donald T. also did this very charming thing. He had encoded his individual watercolors with names of the Dion quintuplets, and that resulted in observations like, "Annette and Cecile make purple." So Kanner sees this as a communicative failure. This is a sign of the autistic subject's inflexibility. But there's actually no communicative failure here. Kanner understands Annette and Cecile make purple, and it's quite obvious that Donald T.'s hexagon, which is a 6-sided figure, is both responsive to the question about math and also, by the way, correct. Still, these kinds of examples are put forward as a kind of antagonistic departure from authentic communication, right? This way of using language is somehow aggressive or hostile or resistant. The thing is that Kanner reports all kinds of autistic language as waste. So when parents came to him and said, "Oh, no, my child is actually very gifted with language," and he says that the parents would report that the children had learned at an early age to repeat an inordinate number of nursery rhymes, prayers, lists of animals, the roster of presidents, the alphabet, forward and backward, even foreign language lullabies. But in Kanner's view, and these are his words, all of these words, numbers, and poems could hardly have more meaning than sets of nonsense syllables. So Kanner's idea is that as far as the communicative functions of speech are concerned, there's no fundamental difference between autistic children who can speak and autistic children who are non-speaking. All of this is waste language. And Asperger makes a similar kind of observation, not specifically having to do with language, but having to do with sort of the autistic approach to the world. So Asperger's observation is that the autistic individual just stacks boxes full of useless junk. And this makes me think back on the stuff from Luca's pockets, my son's pockets, and it makes me think back on that collection of wealth, that pile of wealth that Tom Sawyer had amassed for himself. But I'm also thinking about things like the sculpture that's pictured here by Arthur Bispo do Rosario. Did I do okay with that? We actually have a Portuguese speaker in the house. Did I do all right? So this is a handmade box, and it sort of contains an eccentric assortment of found objects. And if you guys wouldn't mind sort of participating again for a minute, what kinds of things do you see in this box, in this sculpture? Yeah, there's that plastic bunny head. A xylophone, that also caught my eye. Say again? Yeah, maybe a reel of tape, some kind of circular engineered item. Yeah, there's a telephone receiver. A fan. God, I had missed that. So this is from a show at the New Museum that I'm actually going to revisit later. But the point isn't whether we understand the sculpture. The value of the sculpture is not determined by its function. And I'm going to turn here to some work by Andy Warhol. This is from the Raid the Icebox exhibition that was at Houston's Rice University in 1969. And I think that these images also provoke similar considerations about the way culture defines waste and art. So there are 3 photos here, which are not described in this script. The first photo is of this kind of mass of chairs, and they're all tucked together, they're pushed together into one corner, so they're clearly not put there for sitting. They're not displayed in some extraordinary way that makes them very, aesthetically beautiful, or that, makes you focus on the design of the chair. And the chairs are also hung from the ceiling and from the walls in this kind of unusual configuration that makes them seem as though they're just sort of thrown there casually. In the next photo, there is an array of large wardrobes or cabinets that are filled up with shoes. And on the tops of those cabinets, there are stacks of hat boxes. And again, these are all sort of seemingly very casually arranged, as though no consideration has been put into how they're there. And in the final frame, there are a bunch of, it looks like oil paintings in very elaborate frames, but they're sitting on the floor, stacked against one another, some with their back facing, some with their back facing the viewer, and these are set up there, again, almost seemingly as an afterthought, with a couple of, I guess those are neoclassical sculptures and a cardboard box. So all of this, even though it's very deliberately put together by Warhol, this was a very challenging show for a lot of people who said, this is like, you're putting together something that's like a supermarket. There's no art to this. There's no rhyme or reason to it. But he's really challenging this invisible boundary between art and waste. Again, evoking Asperger's phrase, useless junk. So the problem with people like Kanner and Asperger making these early determinations about autistic language as waste is that they've actually had a big influence not only on clinical history and culture, but also on the way such language is valued beyond the clinic. And this kind of influence, this clinical influence, creeps into fields like literary criticism and theory. So there's a literary critic, Julie Brown, who suggests, for example, that the author of Moby Dick, Herman Melville, was likely autistic. And she says that she thinks that this is responsible for his lack of connected narrative or plot. And she comments, it's as though the autistic individual is looking through a shoebox filled with random handfuls of pictures and cannot organize them into a photograph album that tells a story. And I think this is some chutzpah for this critic to be, noticing some problem with Melville's writings, it's pathologizing, the person who is arguably the author of the great American novel, Moby Dick, and saying that, the reason that he couldn't kind of thread a normal story together is because of some autistic incompetence. And I'm afraid that this kind of judgment is actually fairly commonplace. So Ashley Kegel, Ashley Kegel does quite a similar thing with Melville's story, Bartleby the Scrivener. And I have an image here of just a page from her article where she talks about repetition, about Melville using repetition rather than a true, about Bartleby's utterance being repetition rather than a true form of communication, and that it doesn't seem appropriate in conversation. She talks about Bartleby using idiosyncratic language in a repetitive manner, that he doesn't address the questions that are asked of him. He uses this kind of echolalia. So all of these observations, these kind of clinical observations in a work of literary criticism, are there without actually adding anything to our understanding or appreciation of Melville's beautifully crafted narrative, by the way. So this is kind of the reason I wrote this book. My purpose is threefold. I'm looking to push back against this discourse of deficit, which is really not useful to us. I'm also looking to re-examine, to open up that autistic language. Kanner's busy taking down all of these autistic words and going, oh yes, there's a problem here and a problem here. And I'm going, wait a second, we can do something else with this language. I'm interested in celebrating the beauty, the complexity, the creative energy of autistic language. And finally, I'm interested in finding those kinds of autistic resonances in texts that are already familiar to us, because I actually think that we owe a kind of debt to these uses of language in what we generally think of as mainstream literature. Before I proceed, I do want to talk just a bit about my method. I don't want to be boring about this, but it's important to me that, even though I'm talking about Kanner and Asperger and clinicians and literary critics, that I'm taking my ideas about what constitutes autistic language from a pretty broad spectrum of research and writing, always including autistic people who write about autistic language. So, when I'm talking about the characteristics of autistic language, I'm not leaning exclusively on clinical narratives. I'm really drawing from family autism narratives. I'm drawing from the writing of autistic people. I'm drawing from literary theorists, some of whom are autistic. And in addition, I'm drawing from the clinical literature. So in doing this research, what I started out doing was just kind of combing through all of this stuff and collecting words and phrases that people use to identify the characteristics of autistic language. And I'm not going to read all of these words to you. There are actually 86 words and phrases here. But again, it would be fun for me if people would sort of shout out the words that jump out at them. Absence of I. Astounding vocabulary. Nonsensical. Modernist. Dictatorial. Listing. Yeah. Say again? Logorrhea. Yeah, that spilling out, that diarrhea of words, logorrhea. So, when I was reading through all of this stuff and thinking about this great pool of words and phrases, I tried to find the things that were repeated most frequently and came to sort of express for me what's most characteristically autistic. But I do want to point out that of all of the characteristic expressions of verbal expressions of autism, the thing that was most remarkable for most of the people who do writing about autistic language is this idea of silence. This idea that there's no difference between autistic people who speak or spoken autistic language and mute autism. When we think about absent, futility, hermeticism, linguistic zero, mutism, non-communicative, non-social, private, all of this stuff is adding up to this idea of silence, this idea of autistic incomprehensibility, arbitrary, evasive, nonsensical, unintelligible, without intention. So Kanner really sets this up when he says there's no fundamental difference between the 8 speaking and the 3 mute children. And when we're thinking about autistic voice, I think we always want to bear this in mind, that silence is integral to an autistic expressive framework. Beyond silence, though, I am proposing these 5 terms: ricochet, apostrophe, ejaculation, discretion, and invention. You don't have to memorize these. We're going to go over them one by one. The term ricochet I use, it's usually identified in the clinical literature as echolalia. It's that repeating, echoing thing, this repeating or reusing of language. And this is actually a strategy, even though it's, this very clearly autistic thing that's widely used in literature. And I have here an example from Gertrude Stein's If I Told Him, a Completed Portrait of Picasso. And once again, my friend, the poet Liz, is going to get up here and
this is less about me being a poet and more about nobody wanting to read Gertrude Stein out loud. Oh, cool. I mean, I like it, but so does Napoleon. If I told him, would he like it? Would he like it if I told him? Would he like it? Would Napoleon? Would he like it? If Napoleon, if I told him, if Napoleon. Would he like it if I told him, if Napoleon? Would he like it if Napoleon, if I told him? If I told him, if Napoleon, if I told him? If I told him, would he like it? Would he like it if I told him? Now. Not now. And now. Now. Exactly as kings. Feeling full for it.
Thanks again. Next, we have this thing that I'm calling apostrophe. And this is often identified in the clinical literature as monologuing. It's this autistic proclivity for employing unidirectional surges of language. This is what my friend and colleague Anthony Easton calls infodump formalism, like the biblical prophets. And here I'd like to share another example from Andy Warhol. This is from his writing. You can't possibly read this page, but I think, if you just scan this image, you can see there are no paragraph breaks, or, there's only one paragraph break. It's this stream of unstoppable language. And yet, this has a place in literature. I use the term ejaculation, which I actually adopt directly from Kanner, who uses this word to talk about a kind of autistic interrupting or blurting out, interjecting. So Donald T., in addition to drawing hexagons, was also very fond of saying, Dahlia, Dahlia, Dahlia. The thing is that this kind of semiotic interruption is part and parcel of classical poetics. And I'm going to show you this example from Wordsworth's surprised by joy. Surprised by joy, impatient as the wind, I turn to share the transport. Oh, with whom? Right? That, with but thee long buried in the silent tomb. That interruption, that disruption, that long dash, which is also, really instrumental to romantic literature in particular, is, I think, a very autistic way of speaking. I use the word discretion to talk about autistic system language. So this is rhetoric that sorts, that organizes, that lists, catalogs, taxonomies, bibliographies. This is the stuff that so many clinicians and theorists see as repetition rather than a true form of communication. But again, this kind of system language actually enjoys widespread use in valued literature. And I'm just going to show you an example from Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe. This is a part of the book, and there's a lot of system language in Robinson Crusoe, but this is just one example, where he's feeling quite depressed about his life alone on the island, and he sits down to kind of make a pros and cons chart. He makes a list of all the evil stuff in his life and then all the good stuff in his life. And just the very first thing on the evil side, I am cast upon a horrible, desolate island, void of all hope of recovery. But on the good side, but I am alive and not drowned as all my ship's company was. He kind of goes through this in this way. Here's another example of this from a poem I love by David Anton, A List of the Delusions of the Insane, What They Are Afraid of. It's a classic list poem. Being followed at night, being lost in a crowd, being dead, having no stomach, having no insides, having a bone in the throat, losing money, being unfit to live, being ill with a mysterious disease, being unable to turn out the light. And finally, I have this idea of invention. And what I mean by invention is this sort of autistic tendency or desire, inclination to use words and language in fresh and original ways. So I'm thinking here, about Donald T. again, right? This is, are you really asking me about 10 minus 4, this is so boring. I'll just draw a hexagon, right? This is a way of making things more interesting and exciting. And we see this kind of thing coming out also in language, when autistic people are especially prone to use neologisms, invented words. Here, of course, is a classic example from Lewis Carroll, the poem Jabberwocky. Many of you will know this. 'Twas brillig and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wabe. All mimsy were the borogoves and the mome raths outbrave. These are made up words. They don't technically mean anything. And yet the idea of this poem, the sentiment of it is quite clear. And this use of this very creative, very inventive use of language is both beautiful and useful. So altogether, I'm suggesting these 5 categories: ricochet, apostrophe, ejaculation, discretion, and invention, that these altogether function as a kind of autistic fingerprint. I am getting near the end now. I thank you all for your patience. I just want to talk a bit at the end about this. We're going to go back to that show from the new museum where I showed you the piece by Arthur, we'll get his name again in a moment. Before we talk about that show, though, I just want to share this one important caveat, that I don't think that these categories sort of stay neatly all in their respective corrals. It's not like it's list making over here and invention over there, and they're all these discrete diagnostic features. Instead, I really think that there's a kind of organic relationship between these techniques, and there's a lot of overlapping and overflowing. The point that I was wanting to make, I had misillustrated, is that we have all of these techniques kind of flowing into one another in Robinson Crusoe, where we have repeating, we have invention, we have discretion, all of these things happening simultaneously. Promise you it's real. Okay. We have also something similar going on in this show from 2016 at the New Museum, which was called The Keeper. And it was a show that in particular explored this kind of relationship or tension between art and waste, between collecting and hoarding. And I want to go back and take another look at this sculpture by Arthur Bispo do Rosario. I promised you I would get you his name again. You can see here that there is, these are found objects. So the stuff that he has composed, is probably garbage. There are things that he found in the street. There are things that other people were discarding. There are things that are broken, that are dirty. And yet the intentionality of this sculpture is very evident, right? It's clearly composed in these 4 discrete segments. The stuff that otherwise would be waste is very carefully arranged in a way that brings some pleasure, that suggests some idea of order, even if it's not visible to us. Just another piece from the show are all of these scrapbooks. So this is just one page from one scrapbook by Shinro Otake. And it's sort of used as classic collage techniques, except that the papers that are being used are scraps from magazines. There's a picture there, a double picture of what looks like Elvis Presley. There's what looks like a label from some kind of food. There's a picture that looks like it's torn from a magazine of some palm trees. There are some Japanese letters, and it's overlaid with tape. It doesn't have a particular meaning, and yet the texture that's here is has real value. The part of the exhibition I really want to focus on, though, is this. So the central feature of the exhibition was this vast array of uniformly framed teddy bear photos. And so we have this kind of repetition here, this ricochet. And that might feel overwhelming. The collation is so expansive that it can feel meaningless. So the individual pieces don't actually mean anything when you look at them like this. Each piece is kind of just fragmentary and indeterminate. And the teddy bear becomes a kind of cliche. It's a stereotype that gets repeated ad infinitum. Now, I didn't describe that slide, but the thing that I'm talking about is this endless mass of teddy bear photos that are all sort of uniformly framed, and it's floor to ceiling on 3 walls. It was actually 4 walls of the exhibition space. So it's this really overwhelming exposure to teddy bear photos. When we pull out a particular example, though, a single detail from this apostrophic flow, it helps to kind of recalibrate our receptive sensibilities. So we're looking here at a family portrait. This slide portrays a family of 3. There's a smiling mother, and she's propping up a teddy bear for her doughy-faced toddler, who is seated in the lap of his father, and his father is attired in full Nazi regalia. I was so shocked by this photo when I noticed it, right? It was just one of these probably thousands of photos, but it was suggestive for me of how disruptive focusing on a single detail in what appears to be, how disruptive it can be to focus in on a single detail in what appears to be a uniform array. So here in the midst of what seems like endless repetition, this near infinite collection, there's this ejaculatory eruption. This photo that challenges convention, that challenges expectation and relationship, and it introduces new possibilities. So We think of teddy bears as being, expected, regular, comfortable. There's this reassuring icon of family and comfort. But in this particular instance, the family scene is strangely disrupted. It's intruded upon by the implicit presence of radical totalitarian violence. And it opens up for the audience this deep, dissonant well. So, the idea that we can just, have this array of stuff that seems to be all the same, that repetition doesn't matter, that it's all mechanical. The thing that I'm suggesting here is that when this is done by autists or not, when this kind of strategy is used, that there is an implicit disruption available in that. So there is a politics to the disruption, and that it's very troublesome to be thinking of that as blank, as meaningless, as silent. And I'm going to close with this. What I hope is an enjoyably autistic circling back to the site of our opening query about what constitutes waste. The miniature buildings that are pictured on these closing slides were constructed by a guy named Peter Fritz. He was an Austrian insurance clerk in the 1950s and 60s. And these houses were all found in 1993 in a junk shop, and they were wrapped in garbage bags. And I think it's really important that we not lose sight of their existence as reclaimed waste. So at the new museum, when the way you see them here, arrayed in an orderly grid on an expansive white mount that occupies most of the floor space in a small room, the buildings are legitimated as art. Viewers are constricted to a narrow corridor around the central display, and museum guards are rigorously policing visitors, up to and including me, repeatedly warning people not to touch even the mount on which the constructions are displayed. So when they're located in a museum, raised on a pedestal, arranged in uniform order, carefully lit and guarded, and rendered significant by the language of an exhibition plaque, Fritz's work is indisputably art. When it's thus ceremonially arranged and protected, the buildings are granted stature, made sacred by the curator's framing. But the point I want to stress here is that the beauty, the craft, and the creativity of Fritz's work, its fundamental aesthetic value, is actually a fragile construct. It can either be reinforced or destabilized by external systems and conventions. So if they're in garbage bags, they're garbage. But if they're on a museum mount, then they're art. And when we're thinking about autistic language, what this book is really asking us to do is to really think hard about the framing. How are we coming at this language, and how do our ideas, how does our frame make the language meaningful or not, waste or language with value? So Autistic Disturbances asks that we bring this critical consciousness into our interactions with autistic language, and that readers be open to the discovery of autistic voice when we find it in treasured text, but also, crucially, that we be open to the value of autistic voice when it emerges from autistic people. Thanks very much. I didn't pass out. Thanks, everybody. I can have questions, discussion. I'm open to people making points of their own.
I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the distinction that you're making between labeling an author with autism, which you're obviously reacting against, and an author using autistic language, because surely you're not saying that Wordsworth was autistic. I'm curious where the boundary is.
Still, I think, we're asking a question about whether we should be interested in whether the writers themselves are autistic. I mean, it's about the identity of the writer. It's very difficult ground. I am definitely not suggesting that this one or that one is autistic, although I'm not eliminating that possibility either. It's really difficult territory. But I'm also not saying, if you write in an autistic way, that is pointing to you occupying some diagnostic territory. I'm saying, hey, our culture makes use of these ways, these tools, these strategies of poetics, and we love it when Wordsworth is doing it, but then when Elaine C is over here doing it, we're like, oh no, that's garbage. So I think we can't know who's, we can't always know who's autistic and who's not. And sometimes it doesn't matter. But I think that we want to value that language properly when we find it. And we especially want to step back from saying, I don't understand this and therefore it's bad.
My question was going to be very similar, actually. You named what looks like sort of a taxonomy of autistic speech or autistic constructs, and I was going to ask about exclusivity to autism versus general prose and poetry.
Elsewhere in the book, and if you want to find out more about this, you can actually buy it out there. Elsewhere in the book, I talk about the idea of taxonomy or list making and how it's devalued as this kind of mechanistic sort of writing, that it can't, it's stuck, it's not creative, and I point out that that's actually not true, right? In fact, lists and taxonomies, that any kind of modular or component writing is especially open to change, to modification, to insertions and deletions and rearrangements. And I realize this is kind of a roundabout way of answering your question, but I think that when we establish boundaries, the establishing of boundaries doesn't necessarily mean that there's no flowing back and forth, that things can't change. I believe in autism as a real thing, but I am not sure that our definitions of autism are always sufficiently inclusive. So, it's not like, oh, everybody's a little bit autistic, but that we all participate and benefit from autistic ways of thinking, autistic ways of saying things, autistic ways of looking at the world. So I think that it is possible to benefit from an autistic perspective without necessarily occupying the autistic identity. Does that answer it?
I think speech was really inspiring. I got some things to say about my autism, about all these things that I do and say that I shouldn't say, shouldn't do. And the next thing you know, I'm a chaotic mess. And whenever someone is looking and saying the word okay in a strange tone and face, whenever I feel like it, I feel like I say stuff crazy to be honest to people. But I don't want to be the crazy psycho and nervous, feared and hated or anything bad guy to anyone. I want to be heard, to be honest. By Ryan Hanna.
Hi, I have kind of a process question. So you devised these categories, I believe you labeled them of autistic speech, and I was just curious about your process for, I guess, discovering these 5 categories, or what did that look like for you when you were writing?
I think people saw that kind of word cloud, that big, I went through, I read all of this stuff, and, as I was reading it, it took a long time to develop these ideas. It came along slowly. I changed my mind along the way. But, creating actually a list of all of these expressions that I found in, the literature that I was reading, and then seeing, I actually made, lots of lists, where I fit stuff together, and I said, oh, this stuff actually goes with this, and this is recursive, and this, this idea, and then, it kind of took form in that way. Is that helpful? What would it look like if society valued autistic language? This is easier than it seems. There'd be a lot more listening. I think that's the answer to that question. In the process of writing this book, one of the things that I realized is that I'm engaging with other people's language all the time in a way that's very judgmental. And I'm not alone. So, whenever I find myself thinking, impatiently about somebody else's language, or thinking that somebody else's language is somehow broken or ineffectual, I'm turning my focus back on myself and saying, what's going on here? Why am I having trouble processing this? How can I approach this language differently?
So thank you, Julie. I thought that was really fascinating, and the book is quite wonderful too. I think you show really clearly that you don't have to be an autistic author or an autistic character to speak in the rhetoric of autism, to use the autistic idiolect. I want to ask you, isn't the reverse also true? That is, there's no obligation if you identify as a person with autism to speak only in your 5 categories. There's lots of ways of speaking as a person with autism.
Now, Joe is a music professor, but in the English business, Joe, we call this code switching, right? And we all do it all the time. And in fact, one of the criticisms of the book, I think legitimately, is that I don't use autistic authors. I'm not looking at autistic texts. I'm looking at these sort of mainstream texts. But one of the reasons that I do that is because most autistic life writing is written in a very neurotypical style. The idea is that, people are trying to get across the story of their lives. They want to be understood. They want their experience to be understood. They're not playing necessarily with the language that comes first. They are using language that they know other people are going to understand. And, it's often very direct in a way that is poetically less interesting to me than some of the texts that we've been talking about.
So in looking at the list of the 5 different rhetorical techniques that you gave, a lot of, or several of them at least, so for example, especially like discretion, so like system language and ejaculation, also seem to me to be very associated with men, or with male or masculine ways of talking. So thinking about the blurting out of things, or thinking about especially how fields that we consider to be very systematic, like in the sciences, are often associated with maleness and masculinity. I just wondered if you had any thoughts specifically on the interplay of gender with these rhetorical devices that you framed.
I'm not sure I feel completely comfortable responding to that. There is this sort of classic idea that autism is predominantly a male experience and a male identity, which I have always thought is BS. It's, the acculturation of girls and women, forces us into speaking and managing ourselves in certain ways that makes us less culturally visible. And so I think that the autisticisms that would ordinarily belong to people who consider themselves to be girls and women are are often suppressed. So I know that that's not really the question that you were asking, but speaking from a personal perspective, I am, as my long-suffering husband will attest, an interrupter par excellence. I cannot help myself, and I have a consciousness that it is not a polite way of speaking, that it's not okay to do this. And, one of the reasons it's been particularly difficult for me is because I'm conscious that men are allowed to do that. And, women are really penalized for doing that. On the other hand, I think that the system language, women are in fact organizers and list makers, right? So, if we want to think about that in a gendered way, we can talk about scrapbooking and we can talk about interior decorating. And, again, I think that the cultural expectations around masculinity and femininity are often obscuring the way individuals might otherwise express themselves. It's not a complete answer, but it's something. So the question is whether we can use, in popular parlance, whether we can use a word other than deficit to talk about autistic language. For me, I really like the word idiosyncratic. It's not a super popular word, but I don't see any reason why we can't popularize that. Supposedly we are a nation of individuals, prizes, I did it my way, right? Our own way of doing things. Idiosyncrasy I'm down with idiosyncrasy. There has been this, neurodiversity movement, and there's this suggestion of this word divergence. That's also, I think, even though it's widely used, it's a little problematic because there is a suggestion that you are diverging from something which is the main thing. So, yes, I think we need to keep experimenting.
I'm curious about if or how you're thinking about appropriation and all of this, because I'm just listening to it and I'm thinking, all the times you hear people talk about kinds of language that are being used in mainstream text discourse without attribution to, whatever you're identifying as sort of the origin of that language. That's typically thought of as appropriation, but I don't quite get the sense that that's what you're pointing to here. And so I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you understand the relationship between, the mainstream use of this language and the use of it by autists.
So your question about appropriation actually suggests, it operates at a number of levels, right? Because there is a concern about myself as a non-autistic person writing a book about autistic language, which, I was very sensitive to the fact that people might consider that to be an appropriation. And I tried to work as closely as I could with, autistic scholars and, make sure that I was paying attention to people in the autism community, inviting people to comment on the work. I know that this is not your question, but I think it's part of a larger question about appropriation. There's also the way I have taken the language of Donald T. and Elaine C. out of their original contexts, and I'm using that also for my own purposes. It is a kind of appropriation. At the same time, I would actually argue that I'm doing the work of recovery, right? Here, here's autistic voice that was buried in this place where it was always going to be defined in terms of deficit and pathology, and by kind of elevating it. And I actually use it at the very start of my book. I'm saying, this is the foundation, these voices. The question that I think you're actually asking, the more nuanced question, is about, when we're seeing these uses of what I'm terming autistic voice in mainstream texts, or texts by non-autistic writers, do we need to be concerned about non-autistic people appropriating this, the same way that white people might appropriate forms of speech that really belong to people of color? It's the theft of, the theft which is rock and roll, that kind of thing. I will wait to see maybe what somebody smarter than me says further along the road, but in this moment, from where I stand, my thought is this stuff just exists in language, and I'm just holding out my finger and saying there it is. I don't think that language belongs to one community or another, but that doesn't mean that we don't owe a debt to the communities that use it most. And I see Heather here maybe letting us know that it's time. Thanks so much, guys. This was so much fun for me.
All right. Well, we'll keep this pretty short. Just on behalf of Dr. Bates and everyone here at CUNY SPS, thank you all for coming tonight. We hope that you will definitely make a point to check out the events from the CUNY Disability Scholars for the semester. We'd love to see you at some more of these. And as you know, our publisher did give us 2 copies to give away, one tonight to the in-person crowd, one to the online crowd. So tonight for in-person, the magic number was 23, and that belonged to Robert Wrigley. Robert, there you are. And for our online audience, our magic winner was Dawn Smith. So Dawn, we will get in touch with you by email and get your address to get this sent out to you. Will you be signing? Yes, so we can get some signatures as well. So again, thank you for coming. We wish you a great night, and hopefully we'll see you back here. Thanks so much.